Yes, I want to include the broad sweep, but also detail. And of course, I'm, as you will know, a documentary and archival historian, so I tend to go for detail. It's so vivid, but we can't get too bogged down in the detail. I think it's also important that the Ochils, whilst they have a very distinctive local history, in the broad sweep of things, the history of the Ochils follows the history of uplands throughout much of Scotland, particularly lowland Scotland. So it's not a unique story, except in the detail. One of the other things that I'll be talking about in our theme of the last 50 years is that during those 50 years, we have learned a great deal about the Ochils, and obviously I'll try and talk about that. But at the same time, the Ochils are changing. They are changing now in front of our very eyes. And there's some it's quite shocking almost to see the changes that there are. And of course, as I will emphasize in a moment, there has always been change, but now modern change, the rate and the scale is quite different from anything that has happened in the past. And that is tremendously important. And that means that there are necessarily conflicts between various outcomes that we would like to see, which might include, for example, the conservation of the archaeology of the landscapes and doing something about climate change, which is obviously one of the major things. And that in itself is a reminder of another feature, that whilst people in the past, say in the 18th century, will be able to say this is changing because of various local factors, very clearly these issues that we're looking at today, climate change in particular, and so much of the change up there is driven by responses to climate change, apart from being driven by climate change itself. Those changes are coming from out, the pressures are visibly coming from outside. And we have to do something about it. I mean, climate change is real and it needs a response. I don't doubt. At the same time, some of those responses one could regret. So there's conflict. And another sort of almost a little final question, and I'm not going to attempt to answer this. There tends to be a growing response, certainly in relation to climate change, that trees are good. And I would like just to leave you with a question mark hanging over that statement, because it ain't necessarily so. It is so easy to look at the landscapes, and I usually say this in relation to this first slide. You know, we think that the hills are unchanging, but in fact, this is the Coxburn Reservoir up behind Bridge of Allen, opened in the 1860s. Itself a change of that period, but the slope beyond the loch has been ploughed this year and is now all covered in trees. So, you know, newly planted trees, a very dramatic change reflected in the water. Very importantly, again, amongst the more general points, the historical Ochils have always been diverse. They're probably becoming in many ways less diverse now than they've ever been. But in the past, there have been small farms, large farms, common grazings, pasture, arable, peat cutting, mines, a whole range of activity taking place. And as I say, what is different is the rate and scale. The decline of hill farming is obviously very important. And then, of course, there are all these now industrial changes that are so obvious. So we have this increasing understanding, and it's increased a lot over the last 50 years, and I'll be talking about that. At the same time, we are actually, because that ploughing that you're seeing there is destroying the previous landscape that was the historical landscape that was there before. So where were we 50 years ago when FNH began, and began indeed very shortly after um, the launch with the book that was mentioned earlier, and very useful it was, but it did not have a great deal in any nothing in any detail to say about the Ochils. Much of what was known was folkloric. If you wanted to grub around and actually do your own research, you could easily enough look at things like the various statistical accounts of the 1790s and 1840s. Um, there was work on land ownership for Logie Parish and comparable books, many of them not as good. But Mingus Ferguson's book on Logie Parish, published 100 and more years ago, there were some survey projects either then or very shortly afterwards, but there was actually little interest in landscapes and the idea of landscape studies in the tenants or the environment. And that's another very important point, because when I talk about landscape change, I am automatically talking, although I won't be able to go into it in any detail, but you're automatically talking about ecological change. They aren't two separate things. It isn't aesthetics over there and science over there. They're intimately connected one to another. Of course, what people were looking at that time was agricultural history, but that tended to look at larger areas and not to look at the detail of the particular localities in the way that we could and sometimes do now. So the change is there. The two types of change are exemplified. The top left, you see the strips of snow lying in the furrow of Riggin Furrow, just off the Sheriffmuir Road, up behind us, just a mile or so away. That's an 18th century landscape. And that landscape, as you see, bottom left, has now all been covered in trees. This year, that's just happened. I mean, this is dynamic now. And on the other hand, as I say, over the last 50 years, we've learned a great deal, and that's perhaps exemplified best by the Menstrie Glen publication, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, which made Menstrie Glen, I would say, one of the best understood, as it then was, one of the best understood landscapes in Scotland. But Menstrie Glen is now largely covered in trees. I mean, it's happening in front of your eyes. So what do I mean by the Western? I'm talking about the Western Ochils very much. I'm talking about landscapes, so large areas. I'll be talking about archaeological survey. And when I say archaeology, I'm not talking about excavation, important though that can be, but it necessarily looks at quite small areas, a few square meters or whatever. Whereas the sort of methods that you'd require for landscapes are much more wide scale, much larger scale, and can take up a whole glen or a parish or whatever. And I'll talk a little about the methodologies as we move forward. There's also extensive archival evidence for historical landscape change, much more historical evidence than people would have imagined 50 years ago, particularly from the archives, estate plans and things of that kind. And there we are. Now, I began to really realize the potential for documentary and archival work many years ago. I'd been up into Glentye, which is just, so this is just the first photograph was taken just near the old Sheriffmuir Inn, which most of you will know. Looking up into Glentye, I'd been up into the high hills and I was coming down, and I found myself looking at the footings of an abandoned steading, just a Rickle stains, the classic of the sort that you see so widely in the Scottish hills. And I knew of documentary evidence for a man called James Menteith in Glentay, who was a drover turning up in Stirling at various dates between 1709 and 1719. And indeed, you'll see in the right-hand side there his signature attesting that he's got the approval of local gentlemen to travel about with his drove. Um, he wasn't of great importance, but it was a bit of a puzzle because he described James Monteith in Glentay, and where was Glentay? There isn't one. And here's a Ruckler of Staines in Glentay, and John thinks, I wonder, and double checks with the archival indices, and sure enough, there is a testament, that's a will, if you will, for James Monteith in Glentay, who died by a fall from his horse in the Callander area on the 24th of December 1719. He left a widow, several children, one of whom many years later recalled incidents in his father's house in Glentay. He had grain amongst his properties, and we know there was grain because there's Riggin and a grain drying kiln amongst the Rickler Staines. Yeah, it all sort of ties up. So it actually could give you quite a vivid picture of his life, and it confirmed that he was indeed a drover, buying and selling livestock all over Scotland. I mean, it's really quite a very vivid picture. Bill Ingalls wrote a paper about James Monteith and Glentay in volume 27 of Fourth African Historian. There were also testaments for his parents-in-law and their family, the Mitchells, who'd also been in Glentay at an earlier stage. So there's a great potential. You can't do that for all of these sites, but you can certainly do it for some of them. So very much one has to build up slowly using various different methods and technologies. Of course, as I said, archaeological survey has been very important. One of the things that is so important and that we can now do is to correlate what you find in the archaeological survey with what you find in the documents. And it's because you can do that in somewhere like Menstrie Glen, or indeed in Glentay, that the landscape begins to come alive. So this is reflected and very relevant to today. The methodologies of these things. This is you have a plan here of the Sheriff Muir drawn in the 1790s. Many features, most of which you struggle to put your finger on today, something like 40 odd features which people recognized and described and talked about in a detailed legal case in the 1760s. But of course, when you wanted to survey that, then you're talking about chains or a theodolite, and you're very much tied to visible features and what they thought was important then. Gradually, over the years and through the 20th century, the range of methodologies have increased. The first local OS maps to be based on aerial surveys were in 1981. And that greatly increases your potential. And you can see features that suddenly appear in 1981. And I've seen people argue, oh, this is new in 19. It wasn't new at all. It just discovered because they're doing it from an aerial survey and not by standing on the ground. And nowadays, of course, that is much amplified by satellite surveys, which allow you to survey large areas with great precision. Really needs to be precise. It was pointed out to me when I was a bit puzzled when I'm not an archaeologist. If it's not very precise and you have a rectangular building, then it will come out looking skew. It's got to be pretty precise. And of course, you've also now got things like LiDAR. So those methods make a huge difference, and they allow you to look at large areas, and that's exemplified by the Menstrie Glen publication. You find settlements, shielding, field systems, tracks, industrial sites, prehistoric as well as historic and modern. And it's the integration that gives you the wider landscape setting. The documentary sources are many and various, and I can't begin to talk about the differences. and what you get from all of them. Testaments such as that for James Monteith and Glentie can be enormously valuable. And sometimes, for example, they record debts by and to the deceased person. And those will include, in many cases, debts to or by the people in the next farm or other adjacent settlements and so on. So it begins to expand the range of people that you know something about. Divisions of comment here, perhaps my favourite of all these sources, sometimes hundreds of pages of evidence given by people who knew the landscapes, who remembered them, sometimes for many decades beforehand, um, and described them to the court with a view to dividing up the ownership in the here and now, or their here and now. I mean, there are such wonderful details. One guy who was cutting peats on a Sheriff Muir in an area which was sometimes disputed with the estate of Bahadi. And he said, the Laird of Bahadi came by and offered him a snuff. And it's a little glimpse of life in the 1750s. The Laird of Bahadi, it was in his house that my Prince Charlie stayed in Dunblane in 1745. I mean, he's a big gentleman. There are leases, there are deeds, there are legal disputes, and of course, there are things like place names. So there's many things that we can use. Broadly, we can define four main periods of changing use. The medieval, when the land was largely owned by royal, monastic and lordly estates. They either had their own flocks up there or what were called native kindly tenants. And of course, there would also, I'm sure, although we don't have much direct evidence, have been hunting and summer pasture. By a system known as shieling, where you basically live in the low ground and you can take your livestock up into the hills in the summer months to pasture away from the arable crops, and then take and milk. Many of them would be dairy animals, cattle and sheep. You'd milk them, make butter and cheese, which you can then market. It's transportable. So that'd be the main outline of the medieval period. In the early modern, from about 1500, you start getting a change in the land ownership. Many of those big estates are broken up, and ownership passes either to lairds who live on the low ground down below, or in a few cases to people who actually become owner-occupiers or feuars up in the hills themselves, and that's particularly important in the Glendevon area, the eastern part of the Western Ochils. Again, you have a mixture of arable and pasture, but it's very intense settlement. This is probably the period of the most intense settlement in the hills. And that begins to break up, to change. And remember, all the transitions are fuzzy. They doesn't happen overnight. It's not a sudden change. It's a gradual change. That begins to change, and you get the institution of sheep walks, big sheep farms. The small tenancies are amalgamated, large sheep flocks brought in, many of them owned by better off people. And the steep population fall. And of course, that persists until the relatively recent past, when we start moving into this industrial period and the withdrawal of hill farming. So just to recap to the medieval, and I have to use an example from, I am using an example anyway, from the other side of the valley, Dundas and the Carron Valley. The charter, 1236, waste, which was our forest. And in other words, that'd be a deer forest up in the Carron Valley. And in 1317, a rather curious charter confirming the rights of the birds of their right to pasture the people of Stirling to pasture their horses in our forest between the waters of Carron and Forth. And that seems to be way high up in the hills, again in the Carron Valley. And you think, what on earth do the people of Stirling want to have the horses 15 kilometers away or whatever it is? Seems crazy. I think that what it is, that there will be wild horses. They'll be periodically rounded up, not just happens on Dartmoor or whatever, New Forest today. Be rounded up and allocated to various people. And funnily enough, even in the late 16th century, there are farmers up there in that area who still have wild horses in their testaments. So there can be all these sort of something that you wouldn't think about without the positive evidence. So the break of the medieval estates was around from about the 1490s or so, has all sorts of impacts, and I've already mentioned in Glendevon, for example. What happens is a series of quite substantial and well capitalized farms are created. They have many of them have two plough teams. In the 17th century, where many other small tenancies wouldn't have had one, they'd have had to cooperate with their neighbours to have a plough team. And they're quite well capitalized, and they're owner occupied. But mostly, the land in this period was either occupied by small tenants with little farms, and Menstrie Glen's a classic example. Lots of little farms, 20 odd altogether. Documented remains can be found up there in Menstrie Glen and the adjacent areas. The But they're very undercapitalized, and also in some cases there are still people on the low ground who own land in the hills, and various complex arrangements about how you actually utilize the hills. You catch this all happening. 1628, Alexander Menteith disposed the land of Manor Powys, which many of you will know, and lowland on the way over towards Tilbury, and the lands of Ashentrool, which was and this is Lossentrool, so Ashentrool is a part of that, and of Coldhaven, which is another part of Lossentrool. And this is so to new people. And it's been fragmented, but almost certainly what that has been the shieling site for his low ground land, but now it's being hived off and managed in a new way. And Glendevon, as I say, is a particularly interesting example of these very large farms. So Glenfray, for example, was even in the 17th century, single large farm. And these farmers build themselves quite substantial houses, way beyond the sort of grandeur the small tenants would have had, quite different. And similarly, it was quite a number of the other sites in Glendevon. See, on occasion, and I mentioned detail earlier on occasion, you get the most astonishing detail. And I think this has to be my favourite. This is from Menstrie Glen. Now, we're lucky at Menstrie Glen. James Wright of Loss, who was the laird of one of those estates in Menstrie Glen, from 1750 to his death in 1769, when he was still quite a young man. And I sometimes say he didn't eat sweeties, I would have found the sweetie papers. He just seems to be an obsessive note taker, quite extraordinary. And jotting things down. I think he would meet people and they'd give him tell him about some balmy idea they had. He said, "Oh, interesting, I'll jot it down." and it goes into the pie. And there we are. But he also kept records of his own farming in enormous detail. I wish there was more time to go into it. This one in particular, 1758, he commissions a man to build a dike, which is to go from the Kirk Ford, which you can identify, to the Cooney Burn, which you can identify. And the dike is there. There it is, here. And this is, and it works out how much it costs per rood, that's per unit length, how much he pays the guy, and then the payments for the hawthorn trees to grow on it. And, you know, this is not just about landscape. This is about ecology, and it's still there. Quite extraordinary. Um, so a big change that's beginning to happen, even in the early 17th century, is the introduction of new types of sheep. Now, traditional sort of sheep would be what they come to call Hainland sheep, and they're small, probably white-faced, and they were a breeding flock, and many people had a few sheep of that kind. And they could go up into the hills, perhaps just in the summer or all year round. And of course, you would hope perhaps that you're going to have more sheep next year than you had this year. But they're thought to be rather frail. They're brought down from the hills in the winter, and they would need to be herded on the low ground. Um, but by about the 1620s, much earlier than we would traditionally have thought, much earlier than anybody would have thought 50 years ago, there are what are called Southland sheep. And these are being bought in from markets in the borders, Linton. It becomes a highly organized market. But these sheep are wethers, that is, castrated males, so they're not a breeding flock. And you have to buy new ones periodically. They are sold, they're clipped 3 times usually for wool, and then sold fat to the butcher. They're expensive, and they stay in the hills all winter in most cases, but they're vulnerable to deep snow drifts and so on. So it's a risky business, but potentially a profitable business. And by and large, it's only the better off people who can manage to do them. And gradually, over the course of the 17th and 18th century, those type of sheep take over. In effect, they're the precursors of, and become seamlessly, they become black sheep. That of course dominated the hills since that time. So it's a major change. There are other changes in the management, and the you know, I think I would say, look at the time, I can't actually see it, but how am I doing? 8 minutes. The right. Um, but gradually, from about the 1760s, particularly, you start getting increasingly an emphasis on enclosure. Um, the and also both on the low ground, but also with march dikes being constructed in the hills, and the result is that many landlords forbid people to bring the Hainland sheep down from the hills to the low ground in the winter. And if you can't do that, you can't keep them. So that leaves the hills open for the um, Southland sheep in the hills. And eventually, from about 1760, you start getting the small tenants evicted, and large sheep farms brought in with shepherds. Oh, that's rather odd. I don't know what's happened to that. Still, um, throughout this period, I'm going to have to race here. Um, Overgrazing had been a recurrent problem. Remember that clearly corresponds to that clearly means ecological change. We can't say exactly how much, but people, even in the statistical accounts, were aware that there had been change in the past. That areas which were now sheep pasture had once been settled. Um, so, and then So that period of sheep farms, probably increasingly large sheep farms, um, dominates from about the mid 18th century through to quite recent times. And then the industrial intrusion begins. Again, it's gradual. One of the first obviously industrial undertakings you can identify is indeed the Cockburn Reservoir that supplied British Island from the 1860s. That later there are a series of other reservoirs in other glens, particularly in the Glen Devon and its tributaries. But then more recently, you start getting other types of industrial change. There were certainly electricity panels coming down through the Ochils from the uh, certainly by the mid 20th century. But then more recently, you're getting wind farms, and very much in response to landscape change. And the last 20 years, increasingly afforestation. Now, this is in Menstrie Glen. Those trees are in areas which were 20 years ago uh, the repositories of the evidence for the past, the previous life, the sort of thing that you saw the 18th century farming tenants and the medieval archaeology and so on. So inevitably, the intrusion of those trees damages the landscapes and the ecology of what we're learning about. Very often, of course, they leave a little halo of trees around the actual settlement site. Um, but it still isolates the settlement sites from their context, which is the crucial thing. Very importantly, sometimes people say, well, this is all right because this is native species and it's diverse and so on. But in landscape terms, the change is almost as dramatic as it would be if it was Sitka spruce. Um, the sites are isolated, and inevitably the ecological impacts are unpredictable. Change is large scale, rapid, and irreversible. And just looking at something like this, I mean, this is up against the vehicles just off the Sherrick Mill Road. That's the Cockburn Reservoir once again in the background. All you see the fence. That's a part of the story. You see the road. It's been there for a very long time, but of course it's now used by vehicles, not by drovers with their droves coming through. You have the pylons. You have the industrial uh, uh, reservoir, and all the area, or most of the area in the midground to the right has been planted with trees. So it's a radical change, and inevitably, and the change is being driven by external factors, largely by government policy. Now, that isn't new. 20th century, late 20th century, subsidies increased grazing pressures because people were paid to have more livestock. You get payment per head. Um, and so people have a lot of heads of livestock. Um, now, again, the driver is coming from outside, but it's a massive change with another very important point is that you probably always, if you've gone walking up in the hills 50 years ago, the chances are that if you met anybody, it would have been it could well have been a shepherd with his sheepdogs and so on. Nowadays, it will be walkers, perhaps campers, perhaps wild swimmers, and all these sort of things. In other words, it's not only become an industrial landscape, but it's become a landscape of leisure. And that brings its own problems. Roads bring traffic. There are footpaths now, there are stiles, there's litter, there are tents, often abandoned tents, campfires, and dogs. So there's all these massive changes. Largely, I think people are not really aware that they are happening. You've had a whole series of changing ecologies. Um, the medieval period, non-intensive grazing, probably mainly in the summer months. Not a great deal of use of it made in the winter. In the early modern, increasing pressure with year-round, as the Southland sheep are brought in, year-round um, pasture greatly increases the pressure on the pasture and has significant impacts on the ecology. In the more modern period, you have the sheep walks, and that the pressure, the grazing pressure undoubtedly increases, and the diversity must decrease almost inevitably because, for example, you remove those areas of arable. Imagine the Ochils with little patches, hundreds of little patches of arable, and the diversity that that would introduce, and that, of course, goes. It's gone gradually, and I remember a magical evening. The first year I was here, in the first summer I was here, 76, walking down from the Sheriff Muir late at night on a June night and listening to the curlews and the lapwings calling. Late, I mean, it was midnight. We'd been to the pub, and it was a magical, magical. You wouldn't hear that now. It's changing before, not only before our eyes, but before our ears. And it's changing in response to government policy and to climate change. Oh, gosh.